I was home alone that afternoon, which wasn't unusual since my parents worked late. I live in a quiet neighborhood where almost everyone knows at least one neighbor, but I've never been the type to interact much with them. It was just another Tuesday, and I was gaming on my computer when the doorbell rang. At first, I thought it was strange because hardly anyone shows up here unannounced. When I went to check, I saw a woman I'd never seen before. She looked to be in her 30s, kind of nervous, but also a little off. She said she was a friend of a neighbor and that their dog had run off. She asked if I'd seen it, and if not, if I could help her look. Something about her made me uneasy right away. I can't really explain it, but there was something off about the way she looked at me and how she spoke. I tried to be polite and told her I hadn't seen any dog and couldn't help. She pressed a little, asking if I was sure, and kept trying to glance past me into the house while talking. I felt uncomfortable, so I ended the conversation by saying I was busy and closed the door. A few minutes later, I peeked out the window and saw her still standing on the sidewalk, messing with her phone and occasionally glancing toward my house. It was weird, but I brushed it off and went back to what I was doing, trying not to overthink it. Night fell, and by then, I'd completely forgotten about the woman. The neighborhood was as quiet as usual, but something felt off. Around 10 p.m., I started hearing footsteps outside in the yard. At first, I thought it might have been a cat or even the dog she mentioned earlier, but when I peeked out the window, I saw two figures moving near the fence. They were wearing dark clothes and trying to stay quiet, but I could hear them whispering to each other. My heart started racing. I quickly closed the curtain and grabbed my phone to call the police, but for a second, I froze, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I heard a noise at the back door. It wasn't a normal knock. It sounded like someone was trying to force the doorknob. Panic set in immediately. I turned off all the lights in the house and ran to my room, locking the door behind me. Then, I heard the sound of something hitting the door harder, followed by a low voice. A woman's voice saying, "Are you sure it's this house?" My blood went cold. It was her, the woman from earlier, but now she wasn't alone. I hid in the corner of my room, trying to keep my breathing as quiet as possible. I could hear heavy footsteps on the front porch now, like someone was circling the house looking for another way in. I grabbed my phone and finally called the police. The dispatcher told me that all their units were busy, and it might take some time for someone to get there. Meanwhile, I heard one of the men call out to the woman, saying something like, "The window latch is loose." My heart sank. I knew I hadn't locked the window in the living room properly earlier. I remembered that my dad kept a metal bar in their bedroom. Moving as silently as I could, with my hands shaking uncontrollably, I crept out of my room to grab it. But as I reached the door to my parents' bedroom, I heard the sound of the window sliding open. A chill ran down my spine because I knew they were inside the house now. I rushed back to my room, locked the door, and pressed the bar against it, praying they wouldn't try to break in. My hands were so sweaty I could barely hold my phone while I texted a close friend, begging him to call for help. The footsteps grew louder in the hallway, and I could hear the floor creaking as they moved closer to my room. My heart felt like it was about to burst, and every second dragged on forever. Then, I heard one of them say, "Let's check the bedrooms." I don't know how I managed to stay calm, but I tightened my grip on the metal bar, ready for the worst. The sound of doorknobs being tested down the hall was agonizing. They started with my parents' room, giving me a few precious seconds, but I knew it was only a matter of time before they got to my door. Then, out of nowhere, I heard the distant sound of a siren. I don't know if it was pure luck or if my friend had managed to alert someone, but it completely changed the situation. I heard hurried footsteps, and one of them shouted, "We gotta go now!" I ran to my window and saw them sprinting across the yard, disappearing into the darkness with the woman. When the police finally arrived and searched the house, they told me no one was there anymore and that the intruders were probably long gone. But that didn't bring me much comfort. Even though the police assured me everything was safe, I haven't been able to stay home alone since that night. The questions keep haunting me. Who were those people? Why did the woman use such a ridiculous excuse to approach me earlier? And the scariest thought, had they been watching me for a while before this happened? Every time I see someone unfamiliar walking around the neighborhood, I get that same sinking feeling in my chest. I still don't have answers to any of it. The only thing I know is that it was real. Every second of that night is burned into my memory like a recurring nightmare. Even now, when I hear footsteps at night, or catch shadows moving outside the window, my heart races like it did that night. I never thought something like this could happen to me, and honestly, I wouldn't wish it on anyone else. I've always been careful with online purchases, but the price on that tablet was just too good to pass up. The ad said it was in great condition, and the pictures made it look practically new. Before reaching out, I checked the seller's profile on the site and it seemed legit. A few completed sales, no complaints. We agreed to meet in the parking lot of a big grocery store, one of those busy spots where you assume nothing sketchy would happen. The guy responded quickly and confirmed the time. Looking back, maybe the speed at which everything was set up should have been my first red flag. I got there right on time and waited for about 5 minutes before he messaged me saying he was parked a little further down in a less crowded area of the lot. That felt a bit odd because the parking lot wasn't full at all, but he said it would be easier to park. I glanced over, and the area he mentioned was definitely emptier. I hesitated for a moment but didn't want to seem paranoid, so I drove over. At the time, I convinced myself he just didn't want to deal with the crowd. When I reached the spot, I saw a car with its hazard lights on. I figured it had to be him. The first thing I noticed was the windows. They were tinted so dark I couldn't see who was inside. I parked nearby, keeping a bit of distance, and texted to let him know I was there. He replied almost immediately, telling me to step out of the car so he could show me the tablet. That made me feel uneasy. So I asked if he could just show it through the window. That's when he got pushy, saying it would be easier if I got out. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. I was already on edge when I noticed another car entering the lot. It was moving slowly, and it parked right behind me, blocking my exit. My heart started racing. There was no one else around, and the vibe was just off. Then, the guy in the first car opened his door and stepped out, holding what looked like a phone. He tried to act casual, but I could tell something was off. He kept one hand in his pocket like he was hiding something. My mind went into full panic mode. I couldn't reverse because the car behind me had completely boxed me in, and getting out of my vehicle felt like the worst idea possible. I quickly locked the doors and pretended to make a phone call, speaking loudly as if someone was on their way. "Yeah, I'm here at the parking lot. You're almost here, right?" I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the person in the car behind me wasn't getting out, but they were definitely watching me. The tension was unbearable, and I could feel the sweat dripping down my back even with the AC on full blast. The guy in front started walking closer to my car, still holding his phone, but keeping that other hand in his pocket. He gestured for me to roll the window down, saying something I couldn't quite make out. I just shook my head and pointed to my phone, acting like I was busy. That seemed to annoy him. His face changed, and he turned to glance at the car behind me, nodding in a way that made it clear they were working together. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just some random misunderstanding, and it was planned. When he gave that nod, the car behind me turned off its headlights. That move sent a chill down my spine. It felt like they were waiting for me to slip up, to panic and do something stupid. I knew I had to think fast. My hands were shaking as I started the car. The guy in front of me noticed and began gesturing angrily, like he was telling me not to move. But there was no way I was staying. I pressed the gas just enough to steer around his car, narrowly avoiding a collision with the one behind me. My only focus was getting out of there. I managed to swerve past them and head toward the busier section of the parking lot. As I got closer to where people were coming in and out of the grocery store, the two cars suddenly stopped following me. One of them turned into another section of the lot, while the other just stayed parked in the distance, almost like they were watching me. I didn't stop to find out what they were planning next. I drove straight toward the main road, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. Once I got onto the main road, I kept driving aimlessly for about 20 minutes, checking my mirrors every few seconds. I was convinced they might still be following me, but neither of their cars showed up again. Eventually, I pulled into a well-lit gas station, parked near the entrance, and just sat there trying to catch my breath. That's when I realized my hands were still trembling, and my heart was pounding so hard it hurt. The reality of how close I might have been to something terrible started sinking in. Out of curiosity, I opened my phone and searched for the tablet listing, wanting to double-check everything. To my shock, the ad was completely gone. It was like it never existed. That's when it hit me. This wasn't some random guy selling a cheap tablet. It was a setup, and they had probably done this before. To this day, I don't know what they were planning, but I know it wasn't good. I've never used online marketplaces the same way again, and I hope sharing this stops someone else from making the same mistake. I've never been the paranoid type of mom. I've always tried to give my son some independence, especially since he's 8 now and goes to a pretty safe school in a quiet residential area. I usually drop him off at the gate and pick him up after school without much worry. But last week, something happened that still gives me chills. On Tuesday, I got there a bit early to pick him up, and that's when I noticed this guy standing across the street. He was leaning against a pole, messing with his phone. But the way he kept looking at the school gate made me uneasy. I figured maybe he was just waiting for someone, but he was alone and looked off. On Wednesday, I showed up around the same time, and there he was again, standing in almost the exact same spot, only this time without his phone. He was just staring at the gate like he was scanning for something, or someone. That's when I started to feel really uncomfortable. It didn't seem like a coincidence anymore. While the other moms chatted or waited in their cars, he stood there, still and focused, his eyes following the kids as they walked out. When my son finally came out, I grabbed his hand and rushed to the car, barely letting him finish talking about his day. That sinking feeling was growing, but I kept telling myself I was overthinking it. On Thursday, I decided to get there earlier on purpose. I parked on the opposite side of the street, where I had a clear view of the school gate, and waited. My heart nearly stopped when I saw the man again. He was wearing the same cap he had on Tuesday, walking slowly, like he was pretending he didn't have a reason to be there. But his eyes were glued to the kids at the gate. My hands were sweating as I gripped the steering wheel. This time, he didn't just stand there. He crossed the street and walked right up to the gate like he was waiting for someone specific. I couldn't sit still. I got out of my car and stayed close to the gate, blending in with the other moms. When my son came out, I saw the man start walking toward him. My heart was pounding, and before I could even react, I heard him call out my son's name. The creepiest part? He got his name right. My son stopped, confused, and the man said something I couldn't quite make out because of the noise from the other kids and cars. Then I noticed him pointing down the street, as if directing my son somewhere. That's when I ran over, my legs moving before my brain could process it. When I got close enough, I heard the man saying he was my son's uncle, and that his grandma had sent him to pick him up. My son, looking confused, turned to me, and the relief I felt when I saw him hesitate gave me the courage to act fast. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice firm, though I was shaking inside. The man stepped back, clearly caught off guard, and started mumbling something about a misunderstanding. I grabbed my son's hand and told him to get in the car right away. The man turned around and walked off quickly, almost like he was fleeing. As I drove home, my son asked me who that man was. That's when it really hit me just how serious this had been. How did he know my son's name? How did he know which school he went to? I immediately called the school to report what had happened, but the principal just said they'd keep an eye out. That wasn't enough to make me feel safe. I spent the whole night replaying the scene in my head, over and over. The way that man looked, the way he smiled when he saw my son, it was all so wrong. I barely slept. On Friday, I decided I wasn't going to let it slide. I got to the school an hour early and parked in the same spot as before. This time I was ready, I had my phone in hand, ready to take a picture or record if he showed up again. And like clockwork, there he was, walking slowly along the sidewalk, wearing the same cap with that same unsettling expression. He stopped near the gate, looked around, and then just stood there, watching the kids. My stomach churned. He wasn't even trying to hide his interest. I didn't wait for him to make a move this time. I got out of the car and stood near the gate, joining the group of moms. He noticed me almost immediately, and for a second, it was like he froze. Then, as if nothing had happened, he turned around and started walking away. But before he disappeared down the street, he glanced over his shoulder and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, calculated, like he was letting me know this wasn't over. I panicked and went straight to the school staff, insisting they call the police. But by the time the security guards showed up, he was long gone. That night, I couldn't think about anything else. I became obsessed with making sure everything was secure, not just at the school, but also at home. I called a few other parents and even joined some school chat groups to warn them. Some of them seemed genuinely worried, but others brushed it off, saying I was probably overreacting. Over the weekend, I tried to distract myself by taking my son to different activities, keeping him away from the usual routine. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every stranger on the street, every parked car felt suspicious. I just couldn't relax. When Monday came around, I got to the school early again, but the man never showed up. He didn't show up on Tuesday either. In fact, I never saw him again. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. But the fear hasn't left me. To this day, I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been there in time, or if my son had believed his story. I never found out who he was or how he knew my son's name. It's a question that haunts me to this day. All I know is that since then, I've never let my guard down, not even for a second. I've never been a big fan of isolated houses, but when my co-workers suggested renting a countryside house for the weekend, I thought it might be fun. We got there on a Friday afternoon, and the house had this rustic, cozy vibe that everyone seemed to love. But for me, something felt off. It's hard to explain, but even with all the laughter and the relaxed atmosphere, I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling, like someone was watching us. I tried to ignore it, thinking I was just being paranoid. It all started that first night. After a barbecue and a few beers, we went inside because it started getting cold. We were hanging out in the living room, laughing, when I noticed something strange. The pillow I had placed on the armrest of the couch was now on the floor, near the door. I thought someone had knocked it over, but nobody had even been near it. I mentioned it casually, and everyone laughed, saying I was overthinking. But after that, I started noticing other things out of place. Little things, a chair slightly moved, a glass that had been on the kitchen counter suddenly appearing in the sink. We even joked about having a prankster ghost in the house. Later that night, when everyone decided to head to bed, I stayed up on the couch scrolling through my phone. The silence in the house felt strange. Not the kind of peaceful silence you'd expect, but the kind that makes you uneasy. Then I heard something coming from the hallway. It sounded like soft, deliberate footsteps, stopping right near the living room door. For a moment I froze, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was one of my co-workers, but when I got up to check, all the bedroom doors were shut, and it seemed like everyone was asleep. I went back to the couch, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Around 3 a.m., the noises started again, but this time they were louder. It sounded like someone walking upstairs, except this house didn't have a second floor. The feeling of being watched became unbearable, and the air felt thick. I tried to wake one of my friends, but he just mumbled something and went back to sleep. That's when I heard the sound of a chair scraping across the kitchen floor. It was so clear. There was no way I could ignore it, like someone was dragging it slowly across the wooden floor. I knew I didn't have the guts to check the kitchen alone, so I just stayed frozen in the living room, listening. The noises stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My heart was pounding and my mind was racing, trying to come up with a logical explanation. After a while, I mustered up enough courage to go and take a look. Everything seemed normal at first. The chair was right where it was supposed to be. But then I noticed marks on the floor, like it had been dragged. Seeing that sent chills down my spine. I tried to convince myself I was overthinking, but when I went back to the couch, I felt like there were eyes on me the entire time. I thought I was the only one feeling this way until one of my coworkers came out of his room. He said he'd woken up because he heard tapping on his window. When he asked if I'd heard it too, I felt a knot in my stomach. We just stood there staring at each other, trying to figure out what was going on. Suddenly, there was this loud bang from the hallway, like a door slamming shut. At that point, there was no more brushing it off. We woke up the rest of the group, and when we went to check, every single door in the house was open. Even the ones we knew had been locked earlier. After that, no one could go back to sleep. We all stayed in the living room, pretending everything was fine, but you could see the fear on everyone's faces. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe one of us had left the doors unlocked. But deep down, we all knew that wasn't it. While we were sitting there, something happened that froze us all in place. One of the chairs in the living room moved on its own. It didn't slide across the floor quickly or anything dramatic. It just shifted back a few inches slowly, like someone had casually pushed it, but no one was near it. That's when some people started panicking. One of my coworkers wanted to bolt out of the house, but it was pitch black and freezing outside, and we were in the middle of nowhere. We decided to stick together and wait for sunrise. The rest of the night was tense. We all sat on the couch or the floor, staring at that chair, almost like we were daring it to move again. The noises didn't stop, but no one had the courage to investigate. It felt like the entire house was alive, creaking and groaning from every corner. When the sun finally came up, the tension eased a little, but no one was truly calm. We decided to step outside for some fresh air and try to figure out what to do next. While some of us debated whether to leave or stay for the rest of the weekend, I went back inside alone to grab my backpack. That's when I saw something that made me want to drop everything and never come back. On the living room wall, where there had been nothing before, was a deep scratch mark, perfectly etched into the surface. It looked like a symbol, something I'd never seen before. I ran out of there without even grabbing my stuff. I told the others what I'd seen, but no one had the nerve to go back and check. We decided to call it quits and end the trip early. Everyone went in one by one to grab just the essentials, and we left that place as fast as we could. To this day, we still talk about that night, but no one has an explanation. Whenever someone tries to suggest it was just a prank, the room falls silent because we all know it wasn't. I still dream about that chair moving on its own, and that symbol on the wall, and I wake up drenched in sweat every time. I've never set foot in a countryside house again, and I don't think I ever will. If you enjoyed the stories, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel to support our work, and never miss the next ones. Thank you.